It is universally accepted that Michelangelo is one of the greatest artists in the history of art. His phenomenal virtuosity as a sculptor and also as a painter and architect is married to a reputation for being hot-tempered and volatile. He was central to the revival in classical Greek and Roman art, but his contribution to Renaissance art and culture went far beyond the mere imitation of antiquity. Indeed, he conjured figures, both carved and painted, that were infused with such psychological intensity and emotional realism they set a new standard of excellence. Michelangelo's most seminal pieces: the massive painting of the biblical narratives on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, the 17-foot-tall and anatomically flawless David, and the heartbreakingly genuine Pietà, are considered some of the greatest achievements in human history. Tourists flock to Rome and Florence to stand before them. Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni was born to Leonardo di Buonarrota and Francesca di Neri del Miniato di Siena, a middle-class family of bankers, living in the small village of Caprese, now known in his honor as Michelangelo Caprese, near Arezzo, Tuscany. His mother's unfortunate and prolonged illness, which led to her death while Michelangelo was just 6 years old, forced his father to place his son in the primary care of his nanny. The nanny was married to a stonecutter, and legend tells it that this forced domestic situation would form the foundation for the artist's lifelong love affair with marble. By the time he was 13 years old, it was clear to his father that Michelangelo had no aptitude for the family vocation. The young boy was sent to apprentice in the well-known Florentine studio of Domenico Ghirlandaio. The art historian Gombrich writes, "In his workshop, the young Michelangelo could certainly learn all the technical tricks of the trade, a solid technique in painting frescoes, and thorough grounding in draftsmanship. But as far as we know, Michelangelo did not enjoy his days in the painter's firm. His ideas about art were different. Instead of acquiring the facile manner of Ghirlandaio, he went out to study the work of the great masters of the past, Giotto, Masaccio, Donatello, and other Greek and Roman sculptors whose work he could see in the Medici collection. The Torment of Saint Anthony. This is the earliest known painting to be ascribed to Michelangelo, completed when he was only 12 or 13 years old and inspired by an engraving by Martin Schongauer. Housed in the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas, the canvas depicts the popular medieval subject of Saint Anthony attacked in the desert by demons. The saint is beset by temptations, which he resists whilst being ambushed in mid-air by the devils. The painting was previously attributed to the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, under whom Michelangelo had served his apprenticeship. Under that attribution, it was bought at a Sotheby's auction in July 2008 by an American art dealer for $2 million. When the export license was obtained that September, the canvas was brought to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, where it was cleaned of discolored varnish and later overpainting and closely examined for the first time. On the basis of stylistic hallmarks such as Michelangelo emphatic cross-hatching, it was decided that the painting was by the younger artist. It was soon bought by the Kimball Art Museum for an undisclosed amount, believed to be in excess of $6 million. Giorgio Vasari, in his Lives of the Artists, noted that Michelangelo had painted St. Anthony after a print by Schongauer, and Ascanio Condivi recorded that Michelangelo had gone to a market to draw fish scales, a feature not present in the original engraving. Besides this enhancement, Michelangelo also added a landscape below the figures, as well as altering the expression of the saint. After only a year in the studio, Lorenzo de' Medici, the de facto ruler of Florence and renowned patron of the arts, asked Ghirlandaio to supply his two best students, Michelangelo and Francesco Granacci, to join the Medici's Humanist Academy. It was a thriving time in Renaissance Florence when artists were encouraged to study the humanities, complementing their creative endeavors with knowledge of ancient Greek and Roman art and philosophy. Progressive artists were moving away from Gothic iconography and devotional work and evolving a Renaissance style that would foreground humanist ideals and celebrate man's primary role in shaping the modern world. Michelangelo studied under the bronze sculptor Bertoldo di Giovanni, bringing him exposure to the great classical sculptures in the Palace of Lorenzo. But as Gombrich says, like Leonardo, Michelangelo was not content with learning the laws of anatomy second-hand, as it were, from antique sculpture. He made his own research into human anatomy, dissected bodies and drew from models, till the human figure did not hold any secrets for him. However, unlike Leonardo, for whom human anatomy was just one of the many riddles of nature, Michelangelo strove with an incredible singleness of purpose to master this one problem, but to master it fully. During this period, Michelangelo obtained permission from the friars at the Church of Santo Spirito to study cadavers in the convent's hospital, where he would gain a deep understanding of human anatomy. Michelangelo's uncanny ability to render the muscular tone of the body was evidenced in two surviving sculptures from the period: Madonna of the Stairs, 1491, and Battle of the Centaurs, 1492. The 17-year-old Michelangelo was given refuge at the convent following the death of his patron, Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, in 1492. By way of a thank you, Michelangelo carved a highly realistic wooden sculpture which hung over the main altar. After the French occupation in the late 18th century, the cross was recorded as lost, but it had in fact been moved to another chapel where it was painted to disguise its origins. Once restored, it was on display at the Museum of Casa Buonarroti, where it remained until 2000 before being returned to its original home at Santo Spirito. Madonna of the Stairs. This relief sculpture is housed in the Casa Buonarroti, Florence, and was completed circa 1491 when Michelangelo was about 17 years old. It is generally believed that this relief and the Battle of the Centaurs were Michelangelo's first two sculptures. The first reference to the Madonna of the Stairs as a work by Michelangelo was in the 1568 edition of Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. It depicts a maternal scene involving the Virgin Mary and her infant son, while an older child, possibly John the Baptist, is depicted standing several steps above the mother. Two other infant boys are also illustrated in the background of the relief. The vertical and horizontal play of lines created by the older boy's somewhat unusual pose could be seen as a symbolic reference to the crucifix. Battle of the Centaurs. Created around 1492, this unfinished marble sculpture concerns a popular narrative subject for artists during ancient times as well as the Renaissance: the mythic battle between the Lapiths and the Centaurs. It is believed the relief sculpture was the last work Michelangelo created while under the patronage of Lorenzo de' Medici, who died shortly after the sculpture's completion. Inspired by a classical relief by Bertoldo di Giovanni, a work in bronze that hung in the Medici Palace, Michelangelo's own interpretation of the Battle of the Centaurs was an innovative breakthrough in the art of sculpture due to its departure from the contemporary practice of working on a discrete plane, opting instead to work multi-dimensionally. It was also the first sculpture Michelangelo created without the use of a bow drill, achieving finer details with the use of a toothed chisel. For these reasons, Michelangelo regarded the Battle of the Centaurs as the best of his early works, serving as a potent reminder of why he was determined in his efforts to become an independent sculptor. It is believed the poet Poliziano suggested the specific subject to Michelangelo, recounting the myth to him. The Battle of the Lapiths and the Centaurs took place at the wedding feast of Pirithous, king of the Lapith, who had long clashed with the neighboring Centaurs. To mark his good intentions, Pirithous invited the Centaurs to his wedding to Hippodamia. However, several of the Centaurs, unused to wine, became drunk, and when the bride was presented to greet the guests, the centaur Eurytion leapt up and attempted to carry her away. This led to a fight and an ensuing year-long war, before the defeated centaurs were expelled from Thessaly. The ancient Greek sculptors of the school of Phidias considered the battle of the Lapiths and Centaurs as symbolic of the great conflict between order and chaos, and a metaphor for the difference between the civilized Greeks and the Persian barbarians. Therefore, battles between Lapiths and centaurs were depicted in the sculptured friezes on the Parthenon and on Zeus's temple at Olympia. Michelangelo relief consists of a mass of nude figures, writhing in combat, placed underneath a roughed-out strip, in which the artist's chisel marks remain visible. The centaurs are obscured in appearance as most of the figures are represented from the waist up. One of the few identifiable centaurs is visible in the bottom center, while Hippodamia can be seen among the figures in the center right. The Battle of the Centaurs was an early turning point of Michelangelo's sculptural technique. Particularly striking is the composition of the figure's upper limbs, which deviate from the carefully articulated norms. Michelangelo also sculpted independently of his preparatory drawings, freeing him from the constraints of two-dimensional vision and allowing him to merge the figures fluidly and multi-dimensionally. Crucifixes. 2 wooden crucifixes have been attributed to Michelangelo, although neither is universally accepted as being his genuine work. Both are relatively small figures, produced during the sculptor's youth. The Santa Spirito figure is a polychrome wood sculpture, believed to have been finished in 1492 and was lost until it was rediscovered by scholars in 1962. Believed to have been made for the high altar of the Church of Santa Maria del Santo Spirito in Florence, Italy. The work is chiefly notable for its depiction of a naked Christ, which would have been true to the Gospels, as Christ's clothing is reported to have been removed by Roman soldiers. Michelangelo was a guest of the convent of Santa Maria del Santo Spirito in Florence when he was 17 years old after the death of his protector Lorenzo de' Medici. Here, he could have made anatomical studies of the corpses coming from the convent's hospital. In exchange, he is said to have sculpted the wooden crucifix, which was placed over the high altar. Today, the crucifix is housed in the octagonal sacristy of the Basilica of Santa Maria del Santo Spirito. The Crucifix Galino, which is currently displayed in Florence's Bargello Museum, was acquired in December 2008 by the Italian government from the antique dealer Giancarlo Galino for $3.2 million. It is another polychrome corpus for a crucifix in limewood, but less than half the size of the Santo Spirito figure. The work was attributed by some art historians based only on stylistic criteria, yet the sculpture is not documented by contemporary biographers of Michelangelo Ascanio Condivi and Giorgio Vasari. Several experts have cast doubts on the attribution. In 1494, as the Republic of Florence was under the threat of siege from the French, Michelangelo, fearing for his safety, moved via a brief stop in Venice to the relative safety of Bologna. In the city he was befriended by the wealthy Bolognese senator Giovan Francesco Aldrovandi, who was able to secure the 19-year-old Michelangelo the commission to complete the remaining statuettes for the marble sarcophagus lid for the Arca of St. Dominic. The original lid, by Niccolò dell'Arca, was installed in 1473, with Michelangelo sculpting the few remaining figures, including Saint Proculus, Saint Petronio, and an angel with candelabra in 1496. Still just 19 years old, Michelangelo overshadowed the work of the older sculptor through his fine detail in the folds of the cloth and drapery, and in the figure of Petronio, to whom he brought a tangible sense of movement by representing him in mid-step. Michelangelo returned briefly to Florence after the threat of the French invasion abated. He worked on two statues, one of St. John the Baptist, the other a small Cupid. The Cupid was sold to Cardinal Riario of San Giorgio, who had been duped into believing that it was an antique sculpture. Although angry on learning of the deception, Cardinal Riario was impressed by Michelangelo's skill and invited him to Rome to work on a new project. For this commission, Michelangelo created a statue of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine, which was, on its completion, rejected by the cardinal, who thought it politically imprudent to be associated with a naked pagan figure. Michelangelo, who had already garnered a reputation for being volatile, was left incensed, and many years later instructed his biographer Condivi to deny the commission came from the cardinal at all, and to record it rather as a commission from his banker, Jacopo Galli, who had purchased the finished work. Bacchus. Completed by 1497, Michelangelo depicts Bacchus with rolling eyes and appearing to stagger from the rocky outcrop on which he stands. Sitting behind him is a faun, providing a support base to the statue, who greedily eats the grapes trailing out of Bacchus's left hand. With its swollen breast and abdomen, the Bacchus figure has often been noted for its androgynous quality, which may have been inspired by Donatello's statue of David, housed in the Bargello. The inspiration for the statue appears to be the description in Pliny, the elder's natural history, of a lost bronze sculpture by Praxiteles, depicting Bacchus, drunkenness, and a satyr. Bacchus wears a wreath of ivy leaves, as that plant was sacred to the god. In his right hand he grips a goblet of wine, and in his left, the skin of a tiger, an animal associated with the god for its love of the grape. The hand holding the goblet was broken off and the penis chiseled away before Martin van Heemskerk recorded seeing the sculpture in the 1530s. Only the goblet was restored in the early 1550s. The mutilation may have resulted from wishing to make the sculpture appear of greater antiquity, as it was initially placed among an antique torso and fragmentary Roman reliefs in Jacopo Galli's Roman garden. Michelangelo remained in Rome after completing the Bacchus, and in 1497 the French ambassador, Cardinal Jean Billard de la Grolas, commissioned his Pietà for the chapel of the King of France in St. Peter's Basilica. Probably its most famous interpretation, Pietà was in fact a generic title applied to devotional works designed to prompt worshippers to engage in repentant prayer. What was unusual, although not unheard of, about Michelangelo's sculpture was that he realized two figures from a single block of marble. Moreover, his treatment of his subjects, which foregrounded the artist's acuity with emotion and realism, garnered Michelangelo much praise and many new admirers. Indeed, his Pietà was to become one of his most famous early carvings, one which the 16th century biographer Giorgio Vasari described as something nature is scarcely able to create in the flesh. The Pietà was commissioned for the French Cardinal Jean de Billard, a representative in Rome, to be completed in Carrara marble for his funeral monument. However, the sculpture was moved to its current location in the first chapel of St. Peter's Basilica in the 18th century. The only artwork that Michelangelo ever signed, the sculpture portrays the body of Christ in the lap of Mary following the crucifixion. The theme is of northern origin, popular by that time in France but not yet in Italy. Michelangelo's interpretation of the Pietà is unprecedented in Italian sculpture, balancing the Renaissance ideals of classical beauty with naturalism. The sculpture has been designed in a pyramid structure with the Virgin's head at the apex, as it widens progressively down the drapery of Mary's dress to the base. The figures are out of proportion, owing to the difficulty of depicting a fully grown man cradled full length in a woman's lap. Much of Mary's body is concealed by her monumental drapery, and the relationship of the figures appears natural. Michelangelo's interpretation of the Pietà was far different from those previously created by other artists, as he sculpted a young and beautiful Mary, perhaps suggesting her incorruptible purity rather than an older woman. The marks of the crucifixion are limited to very small nail marks and a slight indication of the wound in Jesus' side, while Christ's face reveals no signs of the ordeals of the Passion. The Pietà took a little under 2 years to complete when it was installed at the chapel of Santa Petronilla, a Roman mausoleum near the south transept of St. Peter's, which the cardinal chose as his funerary chapel. The chapel was later demolished by Bramante during his rebuilding of the basilica. According to Giorgio Vasari, shortly after the installation of the Pietà, Michelangelo overheard someone remark that it was the work of another sculptor, Cristoforo Solari, for which reason Michelangelo decided to sign the sculpture. Michelangelis Buonarrota's Florentina's Facibat. Michelangelo Buonarroti, Florentine, made this, on the sash running across Mary's chest. The signature echoes one used by the ancient Greek artists, Apelles and Polykleitos. Vasari also reports that Michelangelo later regretted his outburst of pride and swore never again to sign one of his works. Over the centuries, the Pietà has sustained much damage. 4 fingers on Mary's left hand, broken during a move, were restored in 1736 by Giuseppe Lirioni, and scholars are divided as to whether the restorer took liberties to make the gesture more rhetorical. The most substantial damage occurred on May 21st, 1972, Pentecost Sunday, when a mentally ill geologist named Laszlo Toth walked into the chapel and attacked the sculpture with a geologist's hammer, while shouting, "I am Jesus Christ. I have risen from the dead." With 15 blows, he removed Mary's arm at the elbow, knocking off a chunk of her nose and chipping one of her eyelids. Onlookers took many of the pieces of marble that flew off. Later, Some pieces were returned, but many were not, including Mary's nose, which had to be reconstructed from a block cut out from the back. After the attack, the work was painstakingly restored and returned to its place in St. Peter's, just to the right of the entrance, between the Holy Door and the altar of St. Sebastian, where it is now protected by a bulletproof acrylic glass panel. Although his status as one of the period's most divinely gifted artists was now secure, Michelangelo didn't receive any major commissions for some 2 years. Financially, however, this shortage of work and/or money wasn't of primary concern to the artist. As he would say to Condivi towards the end of his life, "However rich I may have been, I have always lived like a poor man." In 1497, the puritanical monk Florentine Girolamo Savonarola became famous for his Bonfire of the Vanities, an event in which he and his supporters publicly burned art and books. Their actions caused an interruption to what had been a thriving period of Renaissance culture. Michelangelo would have to wait until Savonarola's ousting a year later before returning to his beloved Florence. The Madonna and Child with St. John and Angels, completed by circa 1497 and also known as the Manchester Madonna, this unfinished painting is another attributed work of Michelangelo, which is housed in the National Gallery, London. It is one of 3 surviving panel paintings attributed to the artist and is dated to his first period in Rome. The painting's attribution to Michelangelo was in doubt for much of the last 2 centuries, although now most scholars are in agreement that it is, in fact, a genuine attribution. The painting first came to public attention in the Art Treasures exhibition in Manchester in 1857, when it received its title, The Manchester Madonna. The composition's subject arises from a non-biblical tradition that the Virgin Mary and Jesus met Christ's cousin, St. John the Baptist, on the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. The Virgin is depicted with a bared breast, as if she has recently been suckling her infant son, recalling the theme of the virgin breastfeeding common in medieval painting. She grips a book that she attempts to hold away from her son, the contents of which foreshadow his future sacrifice. She looks over her left shoulder at a scroll being read by a pair of angels, bearing the reading, Exe Agnus Dei, Behold the Lamb of God, a customary attribute of John the Baptist. The figures are arranged as if in a frieze, revealing Michelangelo's predilection for a sculptor's vision rather than a painter's. The frieze becomes more convex at its center with the figures of Virgin and Child, as in the later Pitti-Tondo. Another similarity of the painting to the art of relief sculpture is in the plain background. Rather than the landscapes more common for exterior settings, Michelangelo has simply painted an expanse of sky. Many areas of the painting have been left in a preliminary state, where the artist had intended to paint over the black of the Virgin's robe with the rich blue pigment lapis lazuli, and the angels on the left are indicated only by the green underpaint used for flesh tones. The Entombment. Also housed in London's National Gallery, this painting, left unfinished circa 1501, concerns the placing of Jesus' body in the garden tomb. The chronological position of the work has been a source of some dispute, although it is generally considered an early work. Some authorities believe that it may have been executed by one of Michelangelo's pupils from a drawing by the master, or that it was a direct imitation of his work. According to documents discovered in 1981, Michelangelo had been commissioned to paint a panel for the church of Sant'Agostino in Rome, but eventually gave back the sum received. It is probable this was the payment for the entombment, which remained unfinished upon the artist's return to Florence. The center of the panel portrays Christ being carried up a flight of steps to the sepulchre, which was intended to be painted in the blank area at the top right. The bearded older man represented behind him is most likely Joseph of Arimathea, who gave up his tomb for the use as Christ's sepulchre. The long-haired figure on the left is presumably Saint John, wearing a long orange-red gown with Mary Magdalene kneeling at his feet. The floating appearance of some of the figures may be partly explained by the fact that the painting is intended to be viewed from below and due to the panel's unfinished condition. However, the apparent incongruity of the stance of the bearer on the right remains problematic. Interestingly, there is an old story that Michelangelo received a letter from his father at the time he was painting this panel. The letter informed the artist that he should abandon whatever he was doing as a great piece of marble had arrived for him. This, of course, was the marble that would become the David. In 1501, his most majestic achievement in sculpture was born through a commission from the Guild of Wool to complete an unfinished project begun by Agostino di Duccio some 40 years earlier. This project, completed in 1504, was a 17-foot-tall nude statue of the biblical hero David. The work, its importance to the history of sculpture, comparable perhaps to Leonardo's Mona Lisa and its place in the history oil painting, was a testament to the artist's unparalleled excellence at carving breathtakingly real human figures out of inanimate marble. The art historian Creighton Gilbert said of the David, "It has continued to serve as the prime statement of the Renaissance ideal of perfect humanity. Although the sculpture was originally intended for the buttress of the cathedral, the magnificence of the finished work convinced Michelangelo's contemporaries to install it in a more prominent place, to be determined by a commission formed of artists and prominent citizens. They decided that the David would be installed in front of the entrance of the Palazzo dei Priori, now called Palazzo Vecchio, as a symbol of the Florentine Republic." David, widely considered to be the greatest masterpiece of Renaissance sculpture, Michelangelo David was created between 1501 and 1504 and is a 4.34-meter marble statue of the biblical hero, a favored subject in the art of Florence. Originally commissioned as one of a series of statues of prophets to be positioned along the roofline of the east end of Florence Cathedral, the statue was placed instead in the public square, outside the Palazzo della Signoria, Florence's seat of civic government, where it was unveiled on the 8th of September 1504. Due to the nature of the hero it represented, the statue soon came to symbolize the defense of civil liberties embodied in the Republic of Florence, an independent city-state threatened on all sides by more powerful rival states and by the hegemony of the Medici family. The glaring eyes of David were turned in the direction of Rome, the city's most feared enemy. The overseers of the Office of Works of Florence Cathedral had drawn up plans to commission a series of 12 large Old Testament sculptures for the buttresses of the cathedral in the early 15th century. In 1410, Donatello completed the first of the statues, a figure of Joshua in terracotta. A figure of Hercules, also in terracotta, was commissioned from the Florentine sculptor Agostino di Duccio in 1463, and was made perhaps under Donatello's direction. In 1464, keen to continue their project, the Operae contracted Agostino to create a sculpture of David. A block of marble was provided from a quarry in Carrara, a town in the Apuan Alps of northern Tuscany, famous for its quality of marble from ancient times. This colossal stone only progressed as far as the shaping of the legs, feet, and torso, roughing out some drapery and gouging a hole between the legs. Agostino's association with the project ceased, for reasons unknown, following the death of Donatello in 1466. And 10 years later, Antonio Rossellino was commissioned to take up where his predecessor had left off. Rossellino's contract was terminated soon after, and the block of marble remained neglected for 25 years, while exposed to the elements in the yard of the cathedral workshop. This was of great concern to the authorities, since such a large piece of marble was not only costly but represented a large amount of labor and difficulty in its transportation to Florence. For several years they struggled to find a sculptor confident enough to take on the marble, which had come to be known as the Giant. Though Leonardo da Vinci and others were consulted, it was Michelangelo, only 26 years old, who convinced the Operae that he alone was capable for the commission. On 16th August 1501, he was given the official contract to undertake the daunting task. Michelangelo began carving the statue early in the morning on 13th of September, a month after he was awarded the contract. He was to continue working on the David for more than 2 years. On 25th of January 1504, when the sculpture was nearing completion, the Florentine authorities had to acknowledge there would be little possibility of raising the more than 6-ton statue to the roof of the cathedral. They convened a committee of 30 Florentine citizens, comprising many artists, including Leonardo da Vinci and Sandro Botticelli, to decide on an appropriate site for the statue. Though 9 different locations for the statue were discussed, the majority of members were split between 2 sites. One group, led by Giuliano da Sangallo and supported by Leonardo da Vinci and Piero di Cosimo, among others, believed that, due to the imperfections in the marble, the sculpture should be placed under the roof of the Loggia dei Lanzi on Piazza della Signoria. The other group thought it should stand at the entrance to the Palazzo della Signoria, the city's town hall, now known as Palazzo Vecchio. Another opinion, supported by Botticelli, was that the sculpture should be situated on or near the cathedral. In June 1504, David was installed next to the entrance to the Palazzo Vecchio, replacing Donatello's bronze sculpture of Judith and Holofernes, which embodied a similar theme of heroic resistance. It took 4 days to move the statue the half-mile from the workshop into the Piazza della Signoria. Later that summer, the sling and tree stump support were gilded, and the figure was also given a gilded loin garland. In 1873, it was decided that the statue of David was too valuable to be left outside and at risk from the weather and the chance of vandalism, and so it was removed from the piazza. A smaller replica was placed in the Piazza della Signoria in 1910. David is now displayed in the Accademia Gallery in Florence, where it attracts many visitors. In 1991, a man attacked the statue with a hammer he had concealed beneath his jacket, in the process damaging the toes of the left foot before being restrained. The pose of Michelangelo David is unlike that of earlier Renaissance depictions of the hero. The bronze statues by Donatello and Verrocchio represented the hero standing victorious over the head of Goliath, and the painter Andrea del Castagno had represented the youth in mid-swing, even as Goliath's head rested between his feet. But no previous Florentine artist had failed to depict the giant altogether. Michelangelo depicts David before his battle with Goliath, after he has made the decision to fight, the moment between conscious choice and action. His brow is drawn, his neck is tense, and the veins bulge out of his lowered right hand. The twist of his body effectively conveys the feeling that he is in motion, an impression heightened with contrapposto, where the figure stands with most of its weight on one foot so that its shoulders and arms twist off-axis from the hips and legs. This gives the figure a more dynamic appearance, as though he is about to step forward. This is typified in David, as the figure stands with one leg holding its full weight and the other leg forward. This classic pose causes the figure's hips and shoulders to rest at opposing angles, giving a slight S curve to the entire torso. Several painting commissions followed David's completion. Michelangelo's only known surviving painting is Doni Tondo, The Holy Family, 1504. Gilbert writes that the painting betrays the artist's fascination with the work of Leonardo. He adds that Michelangelo regularly denied that anyone influenced him, and his statements have usually been accepted without demur. But Leonardo's return to Florence in 1500 after nearly 20 years was exciting to younger artists there, and later scholars generally agreed that Michelangelo was among those affected. Doni Tondo, now housed in the Uffizi in Florence. This is the only finished panel painting by Michelangelo to survive. The painting was commissioned by Agnolo Doni to commemorate his marriage to Maddalena Strozzi, the daughter of a powerful Tuscan family. The Tondo, a circular framed painting, was most likely created during the period after the Doni's marriage in 1503 or 1504, yet before the Sistine Chapel ceiling frescoes were begun in 1508, dating the painting to approximately late 1506 or 1507. Michelangelo presents the Virgin Mary as the most prominent figure in the composition, as she is fixed in the center of the image, sitting directly on the ground without a cushion, suggesting the theme of her relationship to the earth. The grass directly below the figure is green, sharply contrasting to the grassless ground surrounding her. Saint Joseph has a higher position in the image compared to Mary, symbolizing his status as head of the family, an unusual feature in compositions of the Holy Family. Mary is located between his legs, as if he is protecting her. There is some debate as to whether Mary is receiving the Christ child from Joseph or vice versa. Saint John the Baptist, the patron saint of Florence, is often included in Florentine works depicting the Madonna and Child. He is in the middle ground of the panel between the Holy Family and the background. The elements around the family include plants and water. The painting is still contained within its original frame, which Michelangelo is likely to have helped design. The frame is ornately carved and rather unusual for the 5 heads it contains, protruding 3-dimensionally into space. Similar to the nude young men in the background, the meanings of these heads has been subject to speculation. The frame also contains carvings of crescent moons, stars, vegetation, and lions' heads. These symbols are perhaps references to the Doni and Strozzi families taken from each coat of arms. As depicted on the frame, the moons are bound together with ribbons that interlock with the lions, possibly referencing the marriage of the 2 families. There is a horizontal band separating the foreground and background, dividing the Holy Family from the background figures and Saint John the Baptist. The background figures are 5 nudes whose meaning and function are subject to much speculation and debate. The Holy Family is much larger in size than the nudes in the background, and there appears to be water in between the land where the Holy Family and the nudes are situated. The Holy Family all gaze at Christ, yet none of the nudes look directly at him. Instead, they appear more concerned with their own physical beauty, like Roman youths at the gymnasium. During this time of the high Renaissance in Florence, rivalry between Michelangelo and his peers was fierce, with artists competing for prime commissions and the accolades that came with them. Madonna of Bruges. This Madonna and Child sculpture was the only sculpture by Michelangelo to leave Italy during his lifetime. It was bought by Giovanni and Alessandro Moscheroni from a family of wealthy cloth merchants in Bruges, then one of the leading commercial cities in Europe. The sculpture was sold for 4,000 florin. The depiction of the Madonna and Child differs significantly from earlier representations of the subject, which tended to feature the Virgin smiling down at her Son, held in her arms. Instead, Jesus stands upright, almost unsupported, loosely restrained by his mother's left hand, about to step away from his mother. Mary seems almost unaware of her Son, gazing down and away, as if already conscious of his fate. It is believed the work was originally intended for an altarpiece. If this is so, then it would have been displayed facing slightly to the right and looking down. The sculpture was removed twice from Belgium after its initial arrival. The first was in 1794, after French revolutionaries had conquered the Austrian Netherlands during the French Revolutionary Wars, when the citizens of Bruges were ordered to ship it and several other valuable works of art to Paris. It was returned after Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. The second removal was in 1944 during World War II, with the retreat of German soldiers who smuggled the sculpture to Germany enveloped in mattresses in a Red Cross truck. The sculpture was discovered 2 years later in Altersee, Austria, and again returned. It now sits in the Church of Our Lady in Bruges, Belgium. Following the attack on Michelangelo Pietà in 1972, the sculpture was placed behind bulletproof glass, and the public can only view it from 15 feet away. Leonardo was, at 23 years Michelangelo Sr., the most celebrated figure of all within the Florentine fraternity of Renaissance masters. But an unspoken rivalry between the two men was well known. In 1503, Piero Soderini, the lifetime gonfaloniere of justice, a senior civil servant position akin to the role of mayor, commissioned both artists to paint opposing walls of the Salone dei Cinquecento in the Palazzo Vecchio. As Gombrich writes, it was a dramatic moment in the history of art where these two giants competed for the palm, and all of Florence watched with excitement the progress of their preparations. Sadly, Soderini abandoned the commission and the paintings. Leonardo's The Battle of Anghiari and Michelangelo The Battle of Cassina were never finished. Leonardo returned to Milan while Michelangelo was summoned to Rome by Pope Julius II. The Battle of Cassina, copy by Aristotile da Sangallo. The Battle of Cassina is a lost work, which was commissioned by Piero Soderini, a statesman of the Republic of Florence. It was intended to be a fresco painted on a wall of the Salone dei Cinquecento in Palazzo Vecchio. The opposite wall was to be decorated by Leonardo da Vinci, who was commissioned to depict the Battle of Anghiari. The two battles were notable medieval Florentine victories. The Battle of Cassina was fought on 28 July 1364 between the troops of Florence and Pisa, resulting in the victory of the former. 1,000 Pisans were killed and 2,000 more were captured. Unfortunately, Michelangelo never completed the painting, though he did produce a complete cartoon of the composition. The cartoon was copied by several artists, the most notable extant copy being by Michelangelo's pupil, Sangallo. Some of Michelangelo's preparatory drawings also survive, along with prints of part of the scene by Marcantonio Raimondi. According to Michelangelo biographer Giorgio Vasari, the original cartoon was deliberately destroyed by Michelangelo rival Bartolomeo Bandinelli due to his jealousy of its fame. Michelangelo chose to depict the scene at the beginning of the battle, as the Florentine army was taken by surprise by the Pisans' initial attack. The artist presents Florentine soldiers bathing naked in the river Arno, responding to a trumpet that warns them of the sudden Pisan assault. As the soldiers emerge from the river and buckle on their armor, they are threatened by shots from the enemy. Several soldiers look or point towards the Pisan position to the left. One soldier has apparently been hit and has fallen back into the river, while others leap into action. This selected scene allowed Michelangelo to depict his favored topic, the naked male figure in varieties of contrapposto. Piccolomini altarpiece. Commissioned by Cardinal Francesco Todeschini Piccolomini, the Piccolomini altarpiece is an architectural and sculptural altarpiece in the left nave of Siena Cathedral. It was built between 1481 and 1485 by Andrea Bregno in Carrara marble, with additions that included 4 niche sculptures by Michelangelo, produced between 1501 and 1504, featuring Saints Peter, Augustine, later reworked as Saint Pius, Paul, and Gregory. The Pitti Tondo, Tondo Pitti, is an unfinished marble relief of the Virgin and Child by Michelangelo in round or tondo form. It was executed between 1503 and 1504 while he was residing in Florence, and is now in the Museo Nazionale del Bargello in Florence. The tondo was worked on during the year in which Michelangelo sculpted his David, having found the time to dedicate to some other paid private commissions. The work was not completed before Michelangelo left Florence for Rome, and never to return. Many details are missing, and the sides of the work are not polished. This sculpture was commissioned by Bartolomeo Pitti. His son Miniato, a monk at Monte Oliveto, donated it to Luigi Guicciardini. In 1564, the art historian, Benedetto Varchi, saw the work in the house of Guicciardini's nephew, Piero. In 1823, the Tondo was bought by the Florentine authorities for 200 scudi from the shop of the dealer Fedele Acciai. The Tondo entered the collection of the Museo Nazionale del Bargello in 1873 and was placed where it resides, in the Galleria degli Uffizi. In the unfinished Tondo, only the heads of Mary and of the baby Jesus are in high relief. Mary is depicted with an open book on her knees. Detail of her eyes is not complete, as in the typical style of Michelangelo, but interpretations suggest that her gaze seems distracted, as if she is looking into the distance and meditating on the fate of her son that is foretold in the scriptures she is reading. The cherub upon Mary's forehead symbolizes her knowledge of the prophecies, as is found in the terracotta relief Madonna with Child, that is attributed to Donatello of Padua and dated to c. 1440. The baby Jesus leans on her in a lively contrapposto, and just visible emerging in the background is a young Saint John the Baptist. Apparently, Michelangelo also was influenced by the now-lost cartoon of Saint Anne by Leonardo da Vinci that was exhibited in Florence at the Santissima Annunziata during the years Michelangelo was working on the sculpture. Both works are based on the interaction between the figures. The central figure of the composition is Mary, sitting on a cube block, resembling that in Michelangelo Madonna of the Stairs. Interpretations have suggested that she seems to bend over in order to fill the space allotted by the Tondo, and that her posture gives an impression that she desires to escape from the scene depicted. Her head, in high relief, projects both outward and upward beyond the border of the Tondo and turns left to break the rigidity of the vertical axis of her body. The contrast between the unfinished figure of John the Baptist and the relief of the Virgin also gives the work depth. Taddei Tondo, depicting the Virgin and Child with the infant St. John on a circular relief. This sculpture is located in the Royal Academy of Arts in Piccadilly, London, and is the only marble sculpture by Michelangelo in Britain. The sculpture was purchased by Sir George Beaumont during a visit to Italy in 1821, and it was bequeathed to the Academy in 1830. The Tondo is on display in a purpose-built area on the Sackler Wing level of the Royal Academy. The sculpture was carved in Florence from 1504-06. And this Tondo depicts a seated Virgin Mary with the baby Jesus dynamically sprawled across her lap, turning and looking back over his right shoulder toward the infant Saint John the Baptist, who stands before him looking down and holding a fluttering bird. When viewing the composition, the eye of the viewer is drawn diagonally along Christ's body, back up that of his mother, follows her gaze across to John, and from his face, back to Christ. John, patron saint of Florence, with his attribute of a baptismal bowl, crosses his arms, perhaps in allusion to the cross. Most likely the bird he holds is a goldfinch, not a dove. Christian symbolism sees in this bird a representation of the Passion. The unfinished portion of the marble below the bird might have been intended to become a crown of thorns. Michelangelo execution with only a point and claw chisel, often driven hard and with great energy, is a combination of techniques that helps create a sense of surface unity unbroken by the use of the drill. The Christ Child, almost completely in full relief, is the only figure that is highly finished, except for the feet. St. John is much less finished. Mary is the least finished, and the background is only roughly executed. One critic declares a belief that these marked variations in texture help establish the relative status of the three figures while creating a sense of compositional depth, all the greater for not being more conventionally finished. Many of Michelangelo's works are unfinished. Circumstances around each being unfinished vary. Critical opinions address some of his unfinished works as if completed, however. The 19th century French sculptor and critic Eugène Guillaume declared that what he labeled as Michelangelo non finito was one of the master's expressive devices in his quest for infinite suggestiveness. Saint Matthew. Saint Matthew is a marble sculpture of Matthew the Apostle by Michelangelo. It was intended for a series of 12 apostles for the choir niches of Florence Cathedral, but was left unfinished in 1506 when Michelangelo moved to Rome to work for Pope Julius II. It is currently part of the collection of the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. In Rome, Michelangelo made preparations for the Pope's tomb, a giant mausoleum that was to be completed within a 5-year timeline. Having traveled to the famous quarries at Carrara, he spent some 6 months painstakingly searching out the perfect blocks of marble from which to conjure his figures. Much to his chagrin, Julius recalled Michelangelo to Rome, where he learned that the building earmarked to house the tomb was to be pulled down and the project as a whole put on ice. Michelangelo was incensed and became convinced that there was a conspiracy to destroy him. Indeed, he believed that the architect of the new St. Peter's Basilica, Bramante, was hatching a plot to have him poisoned. In his anger, Michelangelo returned to Florence and wrote a letter to the Pope expressing disgust at his treatment in Rome. Michelangelo found himself at the center of a tricky diplomatic standoff between Florence and Rome. As Gombrich writes, the head of the city of Florence therefore persuaded Michelangelo to return to the services of Julius II and gave him a letter of recommendation in which he said that his art was unequaled throughout Italy, perhaps even throughout the world, and that if he met with kindness, he would achieve things that which would amaze the whole world. Having produced a colossal bronze statue of the Pope for the newly conquered city of Bologna, unceremoniously pulled down once papal occupiers had been repelled, Michelangelo was commissioned by Julius to complete a project already started by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and others. The commission was to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, and legend has it that Bramante had convinced the Pope that Michelangelo was the best man for the job, in the knowledge that Michelangelo was better known for his sculptures and was therefore almost certain to fail in this enormous undertaking. Michelangelo would work on the Sistine Chapel for nearly 4 years. It was a job of extraordinary endurance in which, according to popular mythology, the artist painted the ceiling laying on his back atop a wooden scaffold structure, a task made even more difficult given that the tempestuous artist had dismissed all of his assistants, save one who helped him mix paint. What resulted, however, was a monumental work of stunning virtuosity illustrating stories from the Old Testament, including the creation of the world and Noah and the flood. The finished work, which featured several nude figures, a fairly uncommon feature of the time, would become a towering masterpiece of human creation. Sistine Chapel Ceiling, painted between 1508 and 1512, Michelangelo work on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, the large papal chapel built within the Vatican by Pope Sixtus IV, remains a cornerstone work of high Renaissance art. The ceiling's various painted elements form part of a larger scheme of decoration within the chapel, which includes Michelangelo, later wall fresco, The Last Judgment, as well as other wall paintings by leading 15th century artists, including Sandro Botticelli, Domenico Ghirlandaio, and Pietro Perugino. The chapel also features a set of large tapestries by Raphael, illustrating the doctrine of the Catholic Church. Central to Michelangelo's celebrated ceiling decoration are 9 scenes from the Book of Genesis, of which the creation of Adam is the best known, an image that has achieved an iconic status only equaled by Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa, where the hands of God and Adam are represented at the point of man's creation. The complex design includes several sets of individual figures, both clothed and nude, allowing Michelangelo to fully demonstrate his skill in creating a huge variety of poses for the human figure, destined to influence countless artists for the following centuries. In 1506, Pope Julius II designed a program to paint the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where the walls of the chapel had already been decorated 20 years earlier. The lowest of 3 levels was painted to resemble draped hangings, which was hung on special occasions with the set of tapestries designed by Raphael. The middle level contains a complex scheme of frescoes illustrating the life of Christ on the right side and the life of Moses on the left side. It was carried out by some of the most renowned Renaissance painters: Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, Perugino, Pinturicchio, Signorelli, and Cosimo Rosselli. The upper level of the walls contains the windows, between which are painted pairs of illusionistic niches with representations of the first 32 popes. A draft by Matteo d'Amelia indicates that the ceiling was painted blue and decorated with gold stars, representing the zodiacal constellations. Michelangelo, who was primarily known as a sculptor and not a painter, was reluctant to take on the project. At the time of the ambitious assignment, he was occupied with a very large sculptural commission for the Pope's tomb. Nevertheless, the Pope was adamant, leaving Michelangelo no choice but to accept. Nevertheless, a war with the French broke out, diverting the attention of the Pope, and Michelangelo fled Rome to continue working on his sculpting. The tomb sculptures, however, were never to be finished, as in 1508 the Pope returned to Rome victorious and summoned Michelangelo to return and commence work on the ceiling. The contract was signed on 10th of May 1508. The scheme proposed by the Pope was for 12 large figures of the apostles to occupy the pendentives. Michelangelo negotiated for a grander and more complex scheme, and he was eventually permitted to do as he wished with the ceiling. His scheme for the work ultimately comprised some 300 figures and took 4 years to execute, being completed in 1512. To reach the chapel's ceiling, Michelangelo designed his own scaffold, a flat wooden platform on brackets built out from holes in the wall near the top of the windows, rather than being built up from the floor. It has been speculated that this was in order to cut the cost of timber. According to Michelangelo pupil and biographer Ascanio Condivi, the brackets and frame that supported the steps and flooring were all put in place at the beginning of the work, and a lightweight screen, possibly cloth, was suspended beneath them to catch plaster drips, dust, and excess paint drips. Only half of the building was framed with scaffolding at a time, and the platform was moved as the painting was completed in stages. The areas of the wall covered by the scaffolding still appear as unpainted areas across the bottom of the lunettes. Interestingly, the same holes were used again to hold scaffolding in the recent restoration. Contrary to popular belief, the artist painted in a standing position, not lying on his back as has been passed down into legend. According to Vasari, the work was carried out in extremely uncomfortable conditions, from his having to work with his head tilted upwards. The fresco painting technique involved applying the paint to damp plaster, which Michelangelo had learnt whilst apprenticed in the workshop of Domenico Ghirlandaio, one of the most competent practitioners of this art form at the time. Michelangelo was also almost certainly influenced by the paintings of Luca Signorelli, particularly his works in the Death and Resurrection cycle in Orvieto Cathedral, which feature many nudes and inventive figurative compositions. When first beginning the Sistine ceiling project, the plaster, intonaco, began to grow mold due to being too wet. Therefore, Michelangelo had to remove his initial attempts and start all over again. This time, he tried a new formula created by one of his assistants, Jacopo Lindaco, which involved resisting mold, heralding a new Italian building tradition. As the artist was painting fresco, the plaster was laid in a new section every day, called a giornata. At the beginning of each session, the edges would be scraped away and a new area laid down. The edges between giornate remained somewhat visible, giving a glimpse of how the work would finally appear as they progressed. It was customary for fresco painters to use a full-sized cartoon to transfer a design onto a plaster surface. However, Michelangelo broke from tradition. Confident the intonaco had been well applied, he drew directly onto the ceiling. His energetic sweeping outlines can be seen scraped onto some of the surfaces, while on others a grid is evident, indicating that he enlarged directly onto the ceiling from a small drawing. Michelangelo painted on the damp plaster using a wash technique to apply broad areas of color. Then, as the surface became drier, he revisited these areas with a more linear approach, adding shade and detail with a variety of brushes. For some textured surfaces, such as facial hair and wood grain, he opted for a broad brush with bristles as sparse as a comb. He employed all the finest workshop methods and innovations, combining them with a range of brushwork techniques, exceeding the skills of his previous fresco master Ghirlandaio. The work commenced at the end of the building furthest from the altar, with the latest of the narrative scenes, and progressed towards the altar with the scenes of the creation. The first 3 scenes from the story of Noah contain a much larger number of small figures than the later panels. This is partly because of the subject matter which deals with the fate of humanity, but also because all the figures at that end of the ceiling, including the prophets and ignudi, are smaller than in the central section. The ignudi are 20 athletic nude males that Michelangelo painted as supporting figures at each corner of the 5 smaller narrative scenes, which run along the center of the ceiling. The lean figures are represented as being decorated with a variety of items, including pink ribbons, green bolsters, and large garlands of acorns. As the scale of the work grew larger, Michelangelo's style became broader, with the final narrative scene of God in the act of creation being reportedly painted in a single day. The continual subject matter of the ceiling is the doctrine of humanity's need for salvation as offered by God through Jesus. It is a visual metaphor of humankind's need for a covenant with God. The old covenant of the children of Israel through Moses and the new covenant through Christ had already been represented around the walls of the chapel. The main components of the design are 9 scenes from the book of Genesis, concerning the downfall of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden. These are formed of 5 smaller scenes, each framed and supported by 4 naked youths or ignudi. At either end and beneath the scenes are the figures of 12 men and women that prophesied the birth of Christ. On the crescent-shaped areas, or lunettes, above each of the chapel's windows are tablets listing the ancestors of Christ and accompanying figures. Above them, in the triangular spandrels, a further 8 groups of figures are depicted, though these have not been identified with specific biblical characters. The narrative elements of the ceiling illustrate how God made the world as a perfect creation, placing humanity into the center. The ceiling then portrays how humanity fell into disgrace and was punished by death and separation from God. Humanity then sank further into sin and disgrace, finally to be punished by the Great Flood. Through a lineage of ancestors from Abraham to Joseph, God sends the Savior of humanity, Jesus Christ. The coming of the Savior was prophesied by the prophets of Israel and sibyls of the classical world. The various components of the sealing are linked to this Christian doctrine. Traditionally, the Old Testament was perceived as a prefiguring of the New Testament. Many incidents and characters of the Old Testament were commonly understood as having a direct symbolic link to a particular aspect of the life of Jesus, or to an important element of Christian doctrine, or to a sacrament, such as baptism or the Eucharist. The scenes from the altar towards the main door are ordered as follows: the separation of light and darkness, the creation of the sun, moon, and earth, the separation of land and water, the creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the temptation and expulsion, the sacrifice of Noah, the great flood, the drunkenness of Noah. The medallions represent Abraham about to sacrifice his son Isaac, the destruction of the statue of Baal, the worshippers of Baal being brutally slaughtered, Uriah being beaten to death, Nathan the priest condemning King David for murder and adultery, King David's traitorous son Absalom caught by his hair in a tree while trying to escape and beheaded by David's troops, Joab sneaking up on Abner to murder him, Joram being hurled from a chariot onto his head, Elijah being carried up to heaven. On one medallion, the subject is either obliterated or incomplete. On October 1984, the Vatican commenced a historic first stage of restoration on the Sistine Chapel's lunettes, which then proceeded onto the ceiling paintings and was completed by December 1989. Restoration work then started on the Last Judgment. The whole restoration was unveiled by Pope John Paul II on 8th of April 1994. The colors, which now appear vibrantly fresh with pale pinks, apple greens, vivid yellows and sky blues against a background of warm pearly grey, had become greatly discolored by candle smoke over the years, almost rendering the appearance of the works as monochrome. The restoration has removed the filter of grime to reveal the original colors that Michelangelo had originally intended. Nevertheless, the restoration was met with both praise and criticism. Critics assert that much original work by Michelangelo, in particular pentimenti, highlights, and shadows, were lost in the removal of various accretions. The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel was to have a profound effect upon other artists, even before the great work was completed. Vasari, in his Life of Raphael, records that Bramante, who had the keys to the chapel, let Raphael in to examine the paintings in Michelangelo's absence. On seeing Michelangelo prophets, Raphael went back to the picture of the prophet Isaiah he was painting on a column in the church of Sant'Agostino and, although it was finished, scraped it off the wall and repainted it in a much more powerful manner, in imitation of Michelangelo work. "500 years ago," Vasari wrote, The whole world came running when the vault was revealed, and the sight of it was enough to reduce them to stunned silence. In January 2007, it was estimated that as many as 10,000 visitors passed through the Vatican museums on an average day, and that the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel is, of course, the main attraction. The Vatican, anxious that the newly restored frescoes would suffer damage, announced plans to reduce visiting hours and raise the price in an attempt to discourage visitors. There are few design elements on the Sistine ceiling that have not been subsequently imitated by a leading artist, including the fictional depiction of architecture, the muscular anatomy, the masterful foreshortening, the luminous coloration, and the mysterious putti and ignudi. Among the artists in whose work can be seen the direct influence of Michelangelo are Pontormo, Andrea del Sarto, Correggio, Tintoretto, Annibale Carracci, Paolo Veronese, and El Greco, to name only a few examples. For Michelangelo's own work, the chapel ceiling led to his Mannerist painting of the Last Judgment. The crowded composition of this later wall fresco allowed the artist to develop his inventiveness further with contorted and foreshortened figures, expressing the dual polarities of despair and jubilation. A serious rival to Michelangelo was a 26-year-old upstart named Raphael. He had burst upon the scene and was chosen in 1508 to paint a fresco in Pope Julius II's private library, a commission vied for by both Michelangelo and Leonardo. When Leonardo's health began to fail him, Raphael assumed the role of Michelangelo's greatest rival. Because of Raphael's acuity in depicting anatomy and his finesse for painting nudes, Michelangelo would accuse him of copying his own work. Although acknowledging a degree of debt to Michelangelo, Raphael resented such animosity toward him and responded by painting the artist with his sulking face in the guise of Heraclitus in his famous fresco The School of Athens, 1509-11. Once the Sistine ceiling was completed, Michelangelo returned to work on the earlier project for the tomb of Pope Julius. Between 1513 to 15, he carved Moses, in which many recognize a new level of detail and control in his work that can be traced back to the figures of the prophets he painted on the Sistine ceiling. He also carved 2 further figures, thought to be slaves or prisoners. These pieces were also intended for the Julius tomb project, but they remained in the artist's possession until old age, when he gifted them to a family who had nursed him through an earlier bout of illness. They are now housed in the Louvre. Tomb of Pope Julius II. Pope Julius II commissioned Michelangelo to create this architectural ensemble in 1505, but the work was not completed until 1545, and the finished piece was on a much reduced scale. Originally intended for St. Peter's Basilica, the tomb was instead placed in the church of San Pietro in Vincoli on the Esquiline in Rome, following the Pope's death. The initial designs were for a colossal structure that would have given Michelangelo the room he needed for his superhuman designs. The project was to become one of the great disappointments of the sculptor's life when the Pope, for unexplained reasons, interrupted the commission, possibly because funds had to be diverted for Bramante's rebuilding of St. Peter's. The original project called for a freestanding 3-level structure with over 40 statues. However, in April 1532, a final contract specified a simple wall tomb with less than 1/3 of the figures originally planned. The most famous sculpture associated with the tomb is the figure of Moses, which Michelangelo felt was his most lifelike creation. Legend has it that upon its completion he struck the right knee, commanding, "Now speak," believing that life was the only thing lacking inside the marble. There is a scar on the knee thought to be the mark of a Michelangelo hammer. To the left and right of Moses on the lower level are statues of the biblical characters Leah and Rachel, which were probably both completed by Michelangelo assistants, while several other sculptures, definitely not by Michelangelo, adorn the upper level of the tomb. Michelangelo, famous statues of the dying slave and the rebellious slave were also originally intended for this tomb, but were not included in the monument in its last and reduced design, and are now housed in the Louvre. Another prominent sculpture intended for Pope Julius's tomb was the Genius of Victory, now found in Florence's Palazzo Vecchio. Rebellious Slave. On permanent display in the Louvre, this sculpture of a slave was originally intended for the second version of the tomb of Pope Julius II, commissioned by the Pope's heirs, the Della Rovere, in May 1513. Although the initial plans for a gigantic mausoleum were set aside, the work was still monumental, with a corridor richly decorated with sculptures, and Michelangelo was immediately placed in charge of the work. Among the first pieces completed were the 2 prigioni, renamed the Slaves only in the 19th century, destined for the lower part of the funerary monument, next to the pilasters that framed the niches containing the victories. Their poses were determined by the needs of this architectural setting, so from the front their view was important, while from the side the views received less care than usual. All the prigioni produced in the studio of the artist were eliminated from the monument in its final version when completed in 1542. In 1546, Michelangelo gave the two works in the Louvre to Roberto Strozzi in return for his generous hospitality in his Roman house, following Michelangelo periods of sickness in July 1544 and June 1546. When Strozzi was exiled to Lyon in April 1550 for his opposition to Cosimo de' Medici, he had the two statues sent ahead. In April 1578, they were put on view in two niches in the courtyard of the castle of the Constable of Montmorency at Écouen, near Paris. In 1632, they were sold by Henri II de Montmorency to Cardinal Richelieu. In 1749, the Duke of Richelieu had them taken to Paris and placed in the Pavillon de Hanovre. They were hidden in 1793, but when the widow of the last Marshal of Richelieu attempted to put them on sale, they became the property of the government and joined the collection that is now in the Louvre. The rebellious slave is represented as trying to free himself from the fetters that constrain his hands behind his back, contorting his torso while twisting his head. The sculpture creates the impression of adding a sense of space to the monument, as though the figure is moving towards the viewer, with his raised shoulder and knee. The iconographic significance of the two figures is probably linked to the motif of the captive found from many examples of sculptures in Roman art. For some critics, the rebellious slave represents the trapped sculpture waiting to be set free from the marble. The Dying Slave, one of the Louvre's most celebrated sculptures. The Dying Slave was produced by Michelangelo between 1513 and 1516 and was intended to serve alongside the rebellious slave in the tomb of Pope Julius II. It is a particularly ambiguous sculpture that seems to capture not only the moment of death, but also a moment of extreme bliss or rapture, as the expression on the slave's face could be interpreted as one of pleasure, not pain. The posture and sensual arrangement of limbs also give the piece an erotic charge. The sculpture is given a further mysterious quality by the addition of a roughly hewn ape, which projects from the back of the slave's leg, merging from the supporting branch. Various suggestions have been made over the years as to the artist's intended meaning for this inclusion. Some point out that the ape represents ugliness, whilst the slave is its opposite form, pure beauty. Others identify how the ape is Michelangelo tongue-in-cheek reference to the simplicity of art and representation compared to the reality of the represented forms. Art is merely the aping of true reality. Other slave statues. These 4 sculptures of slaves date from circa 1530 and are all housed in the Galleria dell'Accademia in Florence. Left unfinished, they formed part of the series of prigioni intended for the tomb of Julius II. Crouching Boy, located today in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, this 54 cm marble sculpture represents a naked boy with knees tucked up to his chest as he appears to be pulling a thorn from his foot. The statue is unfinished, although facial features, hair and body shapes are easily recognizable. The Genius of Victory, completed by 1534, this marble sculpture was also intended as part of the design for the tomb of Pope Julius II, most likely for one of the lower niches. The sculpture was left unfinished in Michelangelo's studio after his final departure from Florence in 1534 and became the property of his nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti, who tried to sell it in 1544 without obtaining the necessary authorization from his uncle. Then in 1564, at the suggestion of Daniele da Volterra, the nephew tried to place the sculpture on Michelangelo's tomb in Santa Croce, but Giorgio Vasari, who was redesigning the church's interior, was against this proposal and suggested giving the statue to Duke Cosimo Fafà de' Medici. There the genius of victory came to decorate the Salone dei Cinquecento of the Palazzo Vecchio and was placed along the wall, among the statues of the Labors of Hercules by Vincenzo de' Rossi and others. The sculpture does not represent a moment of fighting, but rather serves as an allegory of victory, depicting a winner that dominates a submissive loser. The figure appears with agility, with one leg that blocks the body of the captive, who is folded and chained. The young man is portrayed as beautiful and elegant, while the dominated man is represented as old and bearded, with a flabby body and a resigned expression. The surfaces are treated expressively to enhance the contrast between the two figures. The young man is polished faultlessly, whilst the conquered figure's texture is rough and incomplete, still retaining the impression of the heavy stone from which it was fashioned. Following Pope Julius II's death in 1513, funds for his tomb were cut, and Michelangelo was commissioned by the new Pope Leo X to work on the facade of the Basilica San Lorenzo, the largest church in Florence, and therefore dedicated to the legacy of the Medici clan rather than the papacy. Michelangelo spent the next 3 years working on it before the project was cancelled due to lack of funds. Florence was under the rule of Cardinal Giulio de' Medici, Pope Leo X's cousin, and the two men formed a close working relationship. Indeed, Michelangelo enjoyed great creative liberties under the cardinal, and this allowed him to move further into the field of architectural design. A project for a parish church in San Lorenzo was never realized, but Michelangelo did work on a design for the Medici chapel. Cristo della Minerva, also known as Christ the Redeemer and Christ carrying the cross. This sculpture was completed in 1521 and is housed in the church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva in Rome. Commissioned in June 1514 by the Roman patrician Metello Vari, who stipulated only that the nude standing figure would have the cross in his arms, the rest of the composition was left entirely to Michelangelo. The sculptor had to give up the first version he was working on in his shop in 1515 when he discovered a black vein in the marble. A new version was hurriedly substituted in 1519 to fulfill the terms of the contract. Michelangelo worked on the piece in Florence before transporting it to Rome, where the final touches were entrusted to an apprentice, Pietro Urbano. However, Urbano damaged the work, and the apprentice had to be quickly replaced with Federico Frizzi, after a suggestion from Sebastiano del Piombo. Metello Vari asked for the first rough version of the sculpture, and it was given to him in January 1522 for the little garden courtyard of his palazzetto near Santa Maria sopra Minerva. The work then became lost for several centuries, until in 2000 Irene Baldriga recognized the first version having been extensively reworked in the 17th century in the sacristy of the Church of San Vincenzo Martire at Bassano Romano near Viterbo. Baldriga identified the black vein clearly distinguishable on Christ's left cheek of the sculpture. The second and official version was celebrated as an impressive achievement by Michelangelo contemporaries. Sebastiano del Piombo, a renowned artist of the Venetian school, humorously declared that the knees alone were worthy of more than the whole of Rome. Christ is represented by Michelangelo unclothed in a standing pose, while the genitalia are exposed in order to show that his sexuality is uncorrupted by lust and controlled by his will. In the ensuing Baroque period, a girdle was added due to changing tastes in art. In the figure's posture, a leg is flexed and the head turned back, according to the principle of contrapposto. Michelangelo worked on the new sacristy, complementing the old sacristy by Brunelleschi that sat on the opposite side of the church between 1520 and 1534. In its own literature, the Medici Chapels describes how Michelangelo worked on the sculptures of the sarcophagi, but the only ones actually completed were the statues of the Dukes Lorenzo and Giuliano, the allegories of dawn and dusk, night and day, and the group of Madonna and Child placed above the sarcophagus of the two Magnifici and flanked by Saints Cosmas and Damian. The latter were executed by Montosoli and Baccio di Montelupo, pupils of Michelangelo. The tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, although never finished, the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici in the Medici Chapel of San Lorenzo in Florence, is the only one of Michelangelo's great architectural sculptural projects to come closest to completion. Built between 1520 and 1534, it is widely regarded as being one of Michelangelo's most stunning achievements in sculpting. The central figure on the tomb is Giuliano de' Medici, the third son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, who stands with his arms resting by his sides and his legs comfortably apart. His posture and expression suggest a cheerful duke, generous in both mind and spirit. He holds in his hand several coins as an intended gift, signifying his generosity to the poor and his status as a patron to artists. Giuliano de' Medici is presented with the allegorical figures of night and day on either side of him. The most celebrated sculpture in the tomb, Night is clearly identified by an owl, a mask, and a clutch of poppies. A moon is represented on her diadem, and her muscular body demonstrates Michelangelo's habit of working from a male model even for his female nudes. The figure of Night ranks for many as one of Michelangelo's finest works. In his entry, The Life of Michelangelo, in the lives of the most eminent painters, sculptors and architects, 1550, Giorgio Vasari quotes an epigram by Giovanni Strozzi, who said of the figure, "Night, whom you see sleeping in such sweet attitudes, was carved in this stone by an angel, and although she sleeps, she has life. Wake her if you don't believe it, and she will speak to you." tomb of Lorenzo de' Medici. Michelangelo started work on this tomb in the Medici chapel simultaneously with the resuming of the works at the new sacristy of Florence during 1524, after Clement VII's election to the papal throne. Working on the tomb at the same time as the tomb of Giuliano de' Medici, Michelangelo produced a statue of Lorenzo de' Medici with allegorical figures of dusk and dawn, reclining on each side of the Duke. However, work on the tomb was interrupted during the siege of Florence and not resumed until 1531. The two tombs, though similar in overall composition, present subtle contrasts and comment on the public image of each man. Whereas Giuliano is presented in an extroverted manner, Michelangelo portrays Lorenzo receding into the shadows, his body closed, his legs crossed and his mind deep in thought, deserving of his sobriquet Il Pensieroso, the thoughtful one. Dusk is given a haunting expression with unfinished surface for his face, strangely at odds with the highly polished finish of the rest of his body. Seen through a veil of marble, his pained expression evokes a surreal quality. The Laurentian Library, Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana, was built into a cloister of the Basilica of San Lorenzo. The library contains manuscripts and early printed books donated by Cosimo the Elder and Lorenzo the Magnificent. It was built under the patronage of Pope Clement VII, who commissioned Michelangelo to design the architecture in 1524. Although often overlooked in surveys of his work, the stairwell, Ricetto, features Michelangelo original wall and floor decorations, while the columns in the library's main chamber are concealed behind the walls, rather than in front, as was typical of classical architectural design, allowing for the rows of desks to be placed in a rhythmic harmony with the windows. The library is considered an early example of the more decorative Mannerist style of high Renaissance art and architecture. Following the capture and looting of Rome by the armies of Charles the Holy Roman Emperor in 1527, Florence was declared a republic. However, the city came under siege in October 1529 before it finally fell in August 1530. In a new agreement between Pope Clement VII and Charles, the Medici family was once more returned to power in the city. Having worked for the defense of the Florence, it is thought that Michelangelo had a profound love of the city rather than a belief in any religious political cause. By designing fortifications, Michelangelo was re-employed by Pope Clement, who gave him a new contract to recommence work on the tomb of Pope Julius II. Leda and the Swan is believed to be a lost tempera painting from 1529, which was probably deliberately destroyed. The image depicted Zeus, the king of the gods, seducing Leda whilst in the form of a swan. The work was commissioned in 1529 by Alfonso d'Este for his Palazzo in Ferrara and taken to France for the royal collection in 1532. The painting was recorded as being in Fontainebleau in 1536. Michelangelo cartoon for the work, given to his assistant Antonio Mini, who used it for several copies for French patrons before his death in 1533, survived for over a century. This composition is known from many copies, including an ambitious engraving by Cornelis Boss, circa 1563, the marble sculpture by Bartolomeo Ammanati in the Bargello, Florence, 2 copies by the young Rubens on his Italian voyage, and the painting after Michelangelo circa 1530 in the National Gallery, London. Michelangelo composition is reported to have had mannerist tendencies of elongation and a twisted pose that was popular at the time. Apollo David, believed to depict the mythological god of the sun Apollo or the biblical character David. This unfinished sculpture dates from 1530 and is housed in the Bargello Museum in Florence. The statue had been commissioned for the private palace of Baccio Valori when the fierce governor was imposed on Florence by Clement VII after recovery of the city from a protracted siege. Work on the sculpture stopped shortly after Alessandro de' Medici was made duke and Michelangelo was forced to flee the city. The sculpture then entered the collection of Duke Cosimo I. It was placed in his private quarters, along with a Bacchus of Baccio Bandinelli, a work of Andrea Sansovino, and an old Ganymede that had been restored by Benvenuto Cellini. Hallmarks of Michelangelo style and methods exist on the unfinished work that support the attribution, though some still question its authenticity. According to Vasari, the sculpture depicts Apollo in the act of taking an arrow from a quiver. In the inventory of Cosimo I of 1553, however, it is identified as the biblical David. Art critics therefore identify the sculpture as one or the other, or by listing a hyphenated title, Apollo David. In 1534, Michelangelo headed to Rome, where he would live out the rest of his days. He sent many letters from Rome to family members, many relating to the marriage of a nephew and the preservation of the family name. His father and brother had recently passed, and Michelangelo reveals himself as someone becoming increasingly concerned about his own mortality. At the age of 57, Michelangelo would establish the first of 3 close friendships. Tommaso dei Cavalieri was a 23-year-old Italian nobleman who is thought to have been the artist's young lover and a lifelong friend. However, some historians, Gilbert included, point out that Michelangelo's sexuality cannot be confirmed, and the fact that he had no heir suggests that in Tommaso, the light of our century, paragon of all the world, as the artist once described him, Michelangelo might have been seeking an adopted son. The belief that Michelangelo was homosexual is nevertheless reinforced by the knowledge that he penned over 300 poems and 75 sonnets, some so homoerotic in nature that his grandnephew, upon publishing these as a collection in 1623, changed the gender pronouns to disguise their original context. In Rome, Michelangelo turned to fresco panting once more, this time in the services of Pope Paul III. In 1534, he found himself again at the site of one of his greatest triumphs, painting a grand and dynamic salvation narrative for the altar wall in the Sistine Chapel. It would take him 7 years to complete. The Last Judgment, with its theme of Jesus' second coming, was part of the grand narrative of Roman Catholic teaching. Michelangelo fresco represented an attempt on the part of the Pope to oppose the Protestant Reformation in what was known as the Counter-Reformation or Catholic Reformation, which was sweeping Northern Europe and had challenged the authority of the Catholic Church. Michelangelo still took subtle liberties with the traditional telling of the biblical story, such as the representation of a beardless Christ, and by omitting altogether his throne and the attendant wingless angels. The Last Judgment. This landmark fresco was executed on the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel from 1536 to 1541, 25 years after Michelangelo had finished the Sistine Chapel ceiling decorations. The fresco depicts the second coming of Christ and God's final judgment of humanity. The souls of humans rise and descend to their fates, as judged by Christ surrounded by prominent saints, including Saints Catherine of Alexandria, Peter, Lawrence, Bartholomew, Paul, Sebastian, John the Baptist, and others. Michelangelo accepted the commission from Pope Clement VII, with the original subject of the mural being the resurrection of Christ. However, following the Pope's death, his successor, Pope Paul III, felt that the Last Judgment was a more fitting subject for 1530s Rome and the judgmental impulses of the Counter-Reformation. Michelangelo's handling of the subject was innovative and unconventional. Whereas traditional medieval depictions of the Last Judgment represented figures dressed according to their social positions, the artist created a new standard, portraying figures equal in status due to their nudity, literally stripped bare of rank. Michelangelo depicts the separation of the blessed and the damned by the saved descending on the left and the damned descending on the right. The fresco is more monochromatic than the ceiling frescoes, perhaps as a result of criticism of his coloring techniques he received in later years, and the work is dominated by the tones of flesh and sky. The recent cleaning and restoration of the fresco, however, revealed a greater chromatic range than previously apparent. Orange, green, yellow, and blue are scattered throughout, animating and unifying the complex scene. The fresco was the subject of a serious dispute between critics of the Catholic Counter-Reformation and those that championed Michelangelo adopted Mannerist style, as exemplified in the painting. The artist was accused of being insensitive to decorum and of flaunting personal style over appropriate depictions of content. A few years after the fresco was completed, the decrees of the Council of Trent urged a tightening up of church control of unusual sacred images. The Pope's own master of ceremonies, Biagio da Cesena, said of the painting, "It was mostly disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures, exposing themselves so shamefully, and that it was no work for a papal chapel, but rather for the public baths and taverns." In response, Michelangelo represented Cesena's face as that of Minos, judge of the underworld, in the far bottom right corner of the fresco, giving the king donkey ears to indicate his foolishness, while his nudity is covered by a coiled snake. It is said that when Cesena complained to the Pope, the pontiff joked that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, so the portrait would have to remain. The genitalia in the fresco, referred to as objectionable, were painted over with drapery after Michelangelo died in 1564 by the Mannerist artist Daniele da Volterra, when the Council of Trent condemned nudity in religious art. Daniele would become famous for this act, earning the humorous nickname Il Braghettone, the breeches maker. Many have identified the face of the man on the flayed skin held by St. Bartholomew as belonging to the artist himself. In his later years, Michelangelo had become a greatly troubled and introspective person who was concerned about his own spiritual fate. Historians now believe he experienced guilt over his homosexuality, leading many to argue that this is why the artist portrayed himself as a flayed sufferer during the Last Judgment. This feeling of guilt would not leave the inwardly troubled painter, and in a later architectural project he waived all fees for his work on St. Peter's Basilica, wishing to bestow his work as a gift to his beloved church. The fresco was restored along with the Sistine Vault between 1980 and 1994 under the supervision of curator of the Vatican Museums, Fabrizio Mancinelli. During the course of the restoration, about half of Daniele's censorship details of fig leaves and breeches were removed. Numerous pieces of buried details, caught under the smoke and grime of centuries, were revealed. Amusingly, it was discovered that the fresco of Biagio de Cesena as Minos with donkey ears was being bitten in the genitalia by a coiled snake. Another interesting discovery was of the figure condemned to hell directly below and to the right of St. Bartholomew with flayed skin, which for centuries had been considered to be male, until the removal of the fig leaf revealed that it was in fact a female. During this period, in which Michelangelo became an official Roman citizen in 1537, he found another close companion in the widow, Vittoria Colonna, the Marquise of Pescara. She too was a poet. Indeed, the majority of Michelangelo poetry is devoted to Colonna, and his adoration of her continued until her death in 1547. He also gifted her paintings and drawings, and one of the most beautiful to have survived is the black chalk drawing Pietà for Vittoria Colonna, 1546. Colonna was the only woman to play a significant part in Michelangelo's life. His mother, we recall, died when he was just a small boy, and their relationship is generally believed to have been platonic. But in 1540, Michelangelo met Cecchino de' Bracci, the 12-year-old son of a wealthy Florentine banker at the court of Pope Paul III. The epitaphs Michelangelo wrote following Cecchino's death 4 years later strongly suggest a sexual relationship. In one, the artist wrote, "Do yet attest for him how gracious I was in bed, when he embraced, and in what the soul doth live." Brutus, completed in 1538. This bust of the Roman patrician Brutus is now housed in the Bargello Museum in Florence. The bust was commissioned by the Republican Donato Gianotti for Cardinal Niccolo Ridolfi in order to celebrate the life of Lorenzino de' Medici, who had earned the name of Brutus by assassinating his distant cousin, Alessandro. During the late period of his career, Michelangelo worked more and more on architectural designs. These included plans for the plaza at the Civic Center at Capitoline Hill with Luigi Vanvitelli, the Church of Santa Maria degli Angeli, construction from 1562, and the Sforza Chapel in the Basilica di Santa Maria Maggiore, 1561-64. But it was for his work on the St. Peter's Basilica that he is best remembered. It was Pope Julius II who proposed demolishing the old basilica and replacing it with what he called the grandest building in Christendom. Although the design by Donato Bramante had been selected in 1505 and foundations laid the following year, little progress had been made since. By the time Michelangelo reluctantly took over the project from his nemesis, Bramante, in 1546, he was in his 70s, stating, "I undertake this only for the love of God and in honor of the Apostle." Michelangelo worked continuously throughout the rest of his life as head architect on the basilica. His most important personal contribution to the project was his work on the design of the dome at the eastern point of the basilica. He dismissed all the ideas of previous architects working on the project except for those of the original designs of Bramante, who, like him, had envisioned a structure to outdo even Brunelleschi's famous dome in Florence. Although the dome was not finished until after his death, the base on which the dome was to be placed was completed, which meant the final version of the dome remains true in essence to Michelangelo's majestic vision. Still the largest church in the world, the dome is both a Roman landmark, rather than just a functional covering for the building's interior, and a testament to Michelangelo's eternal connection to the city. Michelangelo's last paintings, produced between 1542-50, were a series of frescoes for the private Pauline Chapel in the Vatican. One of these paintings, the Crucifixion of St. Peter, features a horseman wearing a turban and restorers, and historians believe that this was in fact a self-portrait of the artist. He continued to sculpt, but did so privately for personal pleasure. He completed a number of pietas, including the Disposition, which he attempted to destroy, as well as his last, the Rondanini Pietà, on which he worked until the last weeks before his death. The Conversion of Saul, housed in the Cappella Paolina, Vatican Palace. The style of this fresco is more Mannerist than Michelangelo's earlier Sistine Chapel frescoes, and for this reason it was not as well received by his contemporaries. The fresco depicts the conversion of the apostle, as related in the New Testament, an event that took place in the life of Paul, leading him to end his persecution of the early Christians and become a follower of Christ. The event is normally dated by researchers to AD 33-36. Within the New Testament, Paul's conversion experience is discussed in both Paul's own letters and in the book known by the title Acts of the Apostles. Crucifixion of St. Peter. Commissioned by Pope Paul, this work is housed in the Cappella Paulina in the Vatican Palace and is believed to be the last fresco completed by Michelangelo. St. Peter is represented at the moment in which he was raised by the Roman soldiers to the cross, with stress given to the depiction of his pain and suffering. Restoration of the fresco, completed in 2009, revealed an image believed to be a self-portrait of Michelangelo himself. The figure is standing in the upper left corner of the fresco wearing a red tunic and a blue turban. Blue turbans were often worn by Renaissance sculptors to keep the dust out of their hair. The mountains are painted in a faint blue hue, which perhaps is intended to increase the depth of field through atmospheric perspective. The land represented in the middle ground and foreground is a pale yellow-green that is in some places more of a yellow ochre in color. The main vertical elements in the painting are the figures, which occupy most of the foreground. Many clusters of people surround a single large central figure that is mounted on a crucifix. Unlike the previous representations of the martyrdom of Peter, Michelangelo depicts the raising of the cross at the moment before the crucifixion has started. The angle of the crucifix activates the composition and makes what might otherwise be a static image into a more dynamic image. The strong diagonal line of the crucifix creates a cyclical visual pattern for the eyes to follow to the group of people located on the top right corner, which in turn leads to the end of the crucifix, whilst the other end points to the men climbing up the steps. Michelangelo also created many strong diagonals with the placement of his figures and the extension of their arms and legs towards a central point of convergence. The positioning of St. Peter himself is often noted as a striking innovation implemented in this work. St. Peter's upper body cranes upward, twisting his neck around so that his eyes make contact with the viewer. The saint's penetrating stare gives the impression that he is demanding our observation of his crucifixion, so that his sacrifice would not be in vain. Florence Pietà, now housed in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Florence. This sculpture was produced between 1547 and 1553 and depicts the dead body of Christ, newly taken down from the cross, while supported by Nicodemus, or Joseph of Arimathea, Mary Magdalene and the Virgin Mary. According to Vasari, Michelangelo intended for the Florence Pietà to decorate his tomb in Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. The biographer noted that Michelangelo began to work on the sculpture around the age of 72, often sculpting tirelessly into the night with just a single candle to illuminate his work. Vasari wrote that Michelangelo began to work on this piece to amuse his mind and to keep his body healthy. After 8 years of working on the piece, in a fit of frustration one day, Michelangelo attempted to destroy the work. This marked the end of his work on the Florence Pietà, and from there, it found its way into the collection of Francesco Bandini, who hired an apprentice sculptor, Tiberius Calcagni, to transform the work to its current composition. Rondanini Pietà, it is recorded that Michelangelo worked on this sculpture group from the 1550s until the final days of his life. Housed in the Museum of Ancient Art of Sforza Castle in Milan, the sculpture reprises the theme of the Virgin Mary mourning over the body of the dead Christ, which the sculptor had explored in his first Pietà of 1499. Like his late series of drawings of the Crucifixion and the Florentine Pietà, portraying the deposition of Christ, intended for Michelangelo's own tomb, the Rondanini Pietà was produced at a time when his own mortality and spirituality was a growing concern for the sculptor. In his final days, Michelangelo hacked at the marble block until only the dismembered right arm of Christ survived from the sculpture as originally conceived. The spectral, waif-like Virgin and Christ are a departure from the idealized figures that exemplified Michelangelo's earlier style, and have been said to bear more of a resemblance to the attenuated figures of Gothic sculpture than those of the Renaissance. On viewing the sculpture from the reverse, it looks as if Jesus is holding Mary up with his back, instead of Mary cradling her son. It has been argued that Michelangelo crafted the sculpture in this way to represent how Jesus' spirit comforted Mary in her loss. Gilbert has observed that a side effect of Michelangelo fame in his lifetime was that his career was more fully documented than that of any artist of the time or earlier, and that he was in fact the subject of two important biographies, a first for a living artist. In the final chapter of his series on artists' lives, 1550, Vasari explicitly presented Michelangelo works as the culminating perfection of art, surpassing the efforts of all those before him. Yet Gilbert explains that Michelangelo was not entirely pleased with Vasari's piece, and arranged for his assistant Ascanio Condivi to write a brief, separate book, 1553, probably based on the artist's own spoken comments. It is, nevertheless, Vasari's lively writing and the influence of the book, which was translated into many languages, that have made it the most usual basis of popular ideas on Michelangelo and other Renaissance artists. Gombrich notes that in his final years, Michelangelo seemed to retire more and more into himself. The poems he wrote show that he was troubled by doubts as to whether his art had been sinful, while his letters make it clear that the higher he rose in esteem in the world, the more difficult and bitter he became. He was not only admired but feared for his temper, and he spared neither high nor low. His highly secretive and guarded nature, and an incident where, while working on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, he threw wooden planks at an approaching pope who he had mistaken for a spy, seems to suggest he suffered with feelings of paranoia. His great companion Tommaso remained with him until his death at home, in Rome, following a short illness in 1564, aged 88. Per his wishes, his body was returned to his beloved Florence and interred at the Basilica di Santa Croce. Michelangelo was the undisputed master of sculpting the human form, which he did with such technical aplomb that his marble seemed to almost transform into living flesh and bone. His dexterity with handling human emotions and psychological insights only enhanced his standing and brought him worldwide fame during his own lifetime. He complemented his Pietas, David, and Moses with what is the most famous ceiling fresco in the world, and has made the Vatican City's Sistine Chapel a site of pilgrimage for those with and without faith. Gombrich said of his cupola for St. Peter's, "As it rises above the city of Rome, supported it seems by a ring of twin columns and soaring up with its clean, majestic outline, it serves as a fitting monument to the spirit of this singular artist, who his contemporaries called divine." Historians have tracked Michelangelo influence through the work of such luminaries as Raphael, Peter Paul Rubens, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, and the last great sculptor to follow in his realist tradition, Auguste Rodin. Yet Gilbert makes the point that Michelangelo belongs to a very select and exalted group of artists, which includes William Shakespeare and Ludwig van Beethoven, who are able to capture the tragic experience of humanity with the greatest depth and universal scope, and as such, their influence on later art is relatively limited. Gilbert's point is that Michelangelo works, like those of Shakespeare and Beethoven, carry an almost cosmic grandeur that was inhibiting for those artists who followed and who might aspire to emulate his achievements. Singer-songwriter Bob Dylan, meanwhile, likened his own songwriting processes to those of Michelangelo. He said in a recent interview, "There's a Duff McKagan song called Chip Away that has profound meaning for me. It's a graphic song. Chip away. Chip away. Like Michelangelo, breaking up solid marble stone to discover the form of King David inside. He didn't build him from the ground up. He chipped away the stone until he discovered the king. It's like my own songwriting. I overwrite something, then I chip away lines and phrases until I get to the real thing."